Awesome. All right. The one problem AI couldn't solve was getting this to work, but luckily we got humans to do the job, so even better. Huge thank you, by the way, to Pedro for letting us. Pedro, that's your name, right? Pedro, for letting us use your laptop. So with that, let's get started. So a little bit about me. This is me from the really fantastic RGov conference that Lander Analytics hosted a couple years ago. If you're wondering, it's like showbiz, but with a K. We're in the heart of showbiz. Not easy, not hard to remember. I'm a research methodologist, as Andy mentioned. I work at NORC at the University of Chicago, get to work on all these fun things. I also profess assistantly at Columbia, and I'm also a political scientist. Just a quick note about NORC if you're wondering. So NORC stands for the National Opinion Research Center, and these days we do more than just opinion research. Basically any area of social science you can think of, we study, and we study using data science and all the things that you guys all love. We work with everyone from the CDC to CNN. If there's a good chance you flip on the news, there's a good chance that you're going to see a NORC study pop up. Okay, all right. Introductions out of the way. So this talk is about AI-augmented survey research. I'm guessing that most of you know what AI is, but you might not exactly know what survey research is. You might say something, 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 human behavior, something, something, something analysis, right? So there's like a technically correct but boring definition of survey research, which is basically along those lines. But for this crowd, let me give you the 2025 definition of survey research, which is basically we are the original prompt engineers. We have been prompt engineering way before it got cool. So always remember that when you're working with someone who claims that they're a prompt engineer. Okay, an in-between definition that's not so facetious is survey research is basically the science of asking people, crucially, right, people questions and taking those answers and turning them into answers about the population, right? So this matters to all of us, right? So questions like, you know, what did you do this year that's deserving of a promotion or a raise? How was tonight's pizza? Questions that are relatively easy to answer but are important are questions that matter to all of us, right? Which policy issues matter to you right now? Maybe slightly harder questions like, why didn't you like our app? Why did you give it only a 1 star? Why did you not get your vaccine this year? There are state and local and federal agencies that want to know the answer to this question. How satisfied were you with that colonoscopy? And finally, the most cursed survey question, cursed survey question of all time, rate your experience at the DMV today, right? Roughly ordered in ease of answering and motivation of you to answer these questions, right? But the bottom line is, right, lots of different kinds of survey questions that matter in our lives. Some are easier to answer and get good answers of people than others. So this is where LLMs enter the picture. And we think that LLMs can potentially, you know, there's some parentheses there, potentially help us do better. They can help us, one, be more productive, and two, potentially reduce error, the kind of natural error that happens at every stage of asking people questions and trying to get good answers, right? Whether you're talking about the very, very kind of upstream stages of survey research where you're defining what your research objectives even are, what are the questions that you even should be asking, right? How are you going to sample people in the population to get those answers? How exactly are you going to ask these questions? Getting the data, right? And then everything that happens after you get the data, whether it's post-processing, validating, or even taking the result of your data and then disseminating it out to the world. So we think that LLMs can potentially be helpful at each of these stages here, right? We also think that while AI and LLMs can augment survey research, we think that surveys can also augment AI and LLMs. So you never really need a reason to have a cat driving a car to be on a slide deck. There's really no reason that I have this here, but I actually do have a reason, which is these are the kinds of questions, these are the kinds of images rather, or data that LLM vendors collect and want to ask certain questions about, right, for labeling purposes, right? So these are two different versions of a labeling task that an LLM vendor might give to a human to do. So the first one, it's asking this labeling question all in one question. And the second one is it's taking each of these response categories and asking about them individually. So show of hands here, how many people would ask if they were the LLM vendor or the research scientist, how many people would ask this question with option A, as option A? Anyone? Okay, couple of hands in the room. How many people would ask this question version B, option B? Okay, great. So it turns out that both of these questions are biased. The first question is biased because it's vulnerable to what we call satisficing. The idea being that respondents are unlikely to give a thoughtful answer when there's so many response categories in one question. So they might button mash. They might just select the first response category and not give it too much thought. It turns out that the second question, the second version, also has a bias known as acquiescence bias, right? That people tend to be, unless you're a psychopath, tend to be a little bit acquiescent, a little bit biased towards a yes answer to strangers asking them questions. It turns out, though, if you actually test these two when you do the survey experiment properly, it turns out that option B, as most of you correctly intuited, produces slightly less biased responses to this question. In general, to this question, I don't know about this cat driving a car image in particular, but the point here, right, is that just as AI can augment surveys, the art of asking questions can also augment how we design and develop and disseminate LLMs. But this talk is really about the former, right, which is AI-augmented survey research. And really the key question I want to talk about is this question of evaluation, which is how do we actually know that LLMs work for survey research? And my answer to this is how we know that anything works, right? How we know any tools work for the purpose that they're designed for. So tools in general don't have guarantees, but they do come with performance benchmarks, right? When somebody hands you a tool, when you're buying a car, there tends to be some benchmarks, some test performance results that the producer, the maker of that car, can say about that car. And you can extend this to any other kind of tool, right? This is what you might call validation, or upstream validation, as it's called sometimes in this literature. And that's different from what you might call evaluation, right? Which is downstream. So once you take that car off the lot, it's sort of up to you to test drive it. And if you're going off-road or doing whatever you want to do, going down the Brooklyn Expressway, right? Like that is the ball is now in your court. It's now your responsibility in some sense to actually evaluate how that car does for your specific goal, right? And so I want to talk to you about 3 specific tasks that LLMs might be tasked with for survey research, and 3 evaluations that we did to know whether they work. And so the first is open-ended response classification. The second is conversational interviewing. And the third is synthetic response generation, which is a controversial idea, but we think it merits evaluation too. There's sort of like a nice ordering here, right? The first is about working with data that we already have. The second is about collecting data better. And the third is about creating data entirely from scratch using LLMs, bypassing, in some sense, data collection altogether. Okay. So let's start with the first one, which is how well can LLMs classify responses to open-ended questions, such as these, right? Somebody might give a lengthy or even short response to a question about, let's say, what's the most important issue facing the country today, and then we want to take that rich textual data and we want to actually make it useful for analysis. So we might assign it a code like immigration, right? So how can LLMs help us here? So I'll cut to the, I'll kind of briefly describe what we did, and then I'll cut to the chase. So we did this around when GPT-4 was sort of one of the leading frontier models available to the public. And what we were interested in was evaluating GPT's zero-shot classification accuracy. Zero-shot, for those who aren't AI auteurs in the audience, zero shot means that there were no training examples provided to the model. And so we evaluated this across a whole bunch of different contexts, across 2 different data sets, 2 very different kinds of data sets, a social media data set, mostly about abortion-related and kind of similar polarized issue topics, and also slightly smaller, versus a data set of open-ended survey responses from the General Social Survey. By the way, if you've heard of NORC, I'm guessing that you would have heard of it from the General Social Survey, which has been happening for almost over 50 years. So 2 very different data sets, 2 different models, in fact 3 different models, 2 GPT models that we tested against each other, GPT-4 and then GPT-4o versus the Azure AutoML algorithm. For folks who do machine learning, this is sort of a nice kind of ensemble approach to selecting a machine learning model for the problem you're facing. We also varied the system prompts, so we varied the level of detail in the system prompt to the model. So just because we didn't provide any training examples doesn't mean that we weren't able to tell it what the actual classes were, what the actual issue topics were that we were looking for. And a variation on this was that we gave some more description for what those issue topics were. We also varied the granularity of these classes, right? So in one variation we condensed the topics to themes, broad themes like the economy, and then in the other we disaggregated them to like more specific subcategories, right? And lastly, we repeated this whole thing many times across different seeds, the idea of basically replicating this across different samples. Each of these kind of serving a different purpose, right? Reliability versus efficiency versus best practices about prompt engineering and so on. Okay, so I'll cut to the chase here. I will talk about our results in 2 buckets. So one is performance and the other has to do with costs. On performance, there were a couple of surprises. So one surprise was that you might think that broader categories or fewer categories might be easier to classify. That did not happen. It was actually harder to classify than the more granular categories. You might think that giving more detail in the prompts, such as giving the class definitions, would be helpful. That actually did worse. That actually, in terms of accuracy and all of the metrics that we know and love with machine learning, that tended to do worse. You might ask about bias, right? Were certain kinds of posts, I mentioned abortion, were certain stances easier to classify than others? The picture there is a little bit less clear. We found that the models, the GPT models in particular, were better at classifying pro-life posts in general when we're talking about accuracy, but they were more likely to conflate pro-choice and neutral posts. So the picture's a little bit less clear there, but one thing that is clear is that GPT outperformed the traditional machine learning approach. I'll summarize the costs by saying that there were not much costs. So the total cost for doing this was something on the order of magnitude of $200. GPT-4o was a lot cheaper than GPT-4, and overall using GPT versus the alternatives were much preferable, time-wise and cost-wise. Okay, let me move on to the second evaluation we did, which is about conversational interviewing. Can LLMs bridge what we might call standardized interviewing and conversational interviewing practices? So going back to this question of what's the most important issue facing the country, you might have a lazy respondent who says the environment and also spells it wrong. And right, this could refer to different things, right? Are they talking about the natural environment? Are they talking about environmentalism? Or are they talking about the political environment, right? These sorts of miscommunications happen all the time in survey research. They happen less when our questions are well defined and we're interviewing, kind of smaller populations. But when you're asking about these broad topics that are complicated, right, having to do with issues or unemployment, that's a good one. Turns out that defining what a job is actually not so easy, requires a series of questions, not just one. There are opportunities there for both the respondent and the interviewer to get confused. And in standardized interviewing, there's no chance for either one to correct each other or to ask for clarification. In conversational interviewing, think when you're actually on the phone with a human interviewer, there's an opportunity to receive and ask for clarification. And so we're asking whether LLMs can fill that role for us. And specifically, we're interested in 3 types of what are called probes, right? 3 types of probes or follow-up questions that one might be able to ask. So one, you might call elaboration probes, right? So the status quo, right, is that you ask this question: what is the most important issue, problem facing the country? The respondent answers, and then we all go home, right? An elaboration probe might ask for, as the name suggests, ask for more detail, right? What do they mean by inflation? Why is that the most important issue facing this country? Inflation is pretty clear, but there might be other instances, right, where there's a much less clear answer that the respondent is giving. Elaboration probes, in some sense, are about raising the ceiling of data quality. But we could also raise the floor of data quality, right? Some people can give really terrible answers to these questions. They can button mash. They can do all sorts of things. They can answer human race when you ask them what their race is, and so on. If you've done survey research, you know what I'm talking about. And so a simple thing like being able to say, hey, I didn't understand you. Do you mind actually giving me a better answer? Can help. And we know that this helps when we do this not using AI, right? And finally, this third category actually draws on the first evaluation we did, which is using AI for classification, right? Usually we do this all at the end, right? We collect our data and we have a guy that looks like this do the classification when all the data is collected, right? Categorizing things like this into cost of living. The advantage of doing this not after data collection, but during data collection is that the respondent can actually confirm whether you are understanding them correctly, right? When we're doing coding, the one coder that we don't have is the respondent themselves, and being able to do this live actually brings the respondent into the process. If we think about this from like a scientific trust standpoint, we are bringing the respondent into the like meaning making of public opinion, which is good, right? And so what we did is we ran an experiment on a conversational AI platform to test the effects of these kinds of probes on things like data quality and respondent experience, right? And again, I'm going to cut to the chase here. So we found 3 things. So we found that AI-assisted live classification is pretty strong off the shelf, meaning with very little additional prompt engineering or fine-tuning or anything like that. We found that probing in general has actually pretty mixed effects on response quality, good in some dimensions, not really any effects on others, and probing actually has a negative effect on user experience, but it's actually pretty small. So on the first point, we found, for example, that asking about economic conditions, we got a classification accuracy rate when we had independent coders go in and code the responses. We found the accuracy to be in the 80 to 90% range, right? Preferred news source was a little bit less good, but without any kind of prompt engineering, right, we think that this is pretty moderately strong off the shelf, right? And there's an interesting kind of footnote here, which is that when the AI was wrong, it tended to be that respondents were likely to say yes. This is another example of acquiescence bias. Even when the AI was wrong in coding, respondents were likely to say yes. So always good to have independent coders do this task. Okay, probing had mixed effects on response quality. So probing was good at increasing the specificity of responses, open-ended responses, and explanatory details, kind of the rich context for why they gave responses that they did. It didn't really increase the relevance or the completeness or the comprehensibility, partly because those were pretty high to begin with in this particular sample. And finally, like I said, small negative effects on user experience. We asked a open-ended question at the end about trying to get at what aspects of the survey experience people found frustrating. And they mentioned things like the cadence, that it didn't feel comfortable. When the LLM was wrong about seemingly basic things like CNN, that was upsetting. There's two potential CNNs, right? There's in this world of LLMs and politics, right? And so mixing them up was not good for our respondents. And finally, people just said, it was awkward. I don't like talking to a robot. This may have to do with latency. This may have to do with other aspects of interacting with a chatbot, right? Okay, let's move on to the third evaluation here. So when LLMs answer surveys, when we bypass data collection altogether, human data collection, and we are in the world of synthetic respondents or synthetic responses, do they resemble humans? Right, and this kind of cuts to the chase itself, right? AI responses, for anyone who's used ChatGPT or the like, this is not surprising. AI tends to respond like this, right? In a way that no human who's spending 5 minutes taking a survey for like 20 cents is gonna answer. And we think that asking this question of whether LLMs resemble humans is an important first question to ask before we get into the question of can they accurately tell us on average how humans are gonna respond. Let's first understand descriptively how LLMs respond to surveys. And so we looked at a couple of different characteristics, a couple of your classic NLP measures of responses. One of them just being straightforwardly response length. The models that we tested all varied in their distribution of response lengths to the questions that we tested, but none of them resembled human survey panelists, right? You got some real passionate responders who maybe use more than just 5 or 10 words, but most people are pretty sparse in their responses to open-ended questions. LLMs are not. We also looked at the lexical diversity of responses, right? How varied is word choice? It's a little less dire for humans, but it's like way off the charts relatively when you look at LLMs. Again, variation between LLMs, but quite different than how humans answer surveys. So what we did is we actually then fine-tuned these models, and we pretty minimally fine-tuned them. We fine-tuned them with just 100 responses. And we started to find that the response length of responses started to more better resemble the distribution of human responses, and we found the same thing for lexical diversity as well. We looked at a bunch of other things too, and they started to converge with just 100 responses in the fine-tuning process.
Questions afterward or questions now?
Sure, I'll take a question. Yeah.
How?
We can circle back to
it.
it.
Let me come back to it.
Yeah, sounds good.
I was just floored by your generosity.
Okay, all right. So to kind of show rather than tell you, so this is like your kind of stock response. So we asked a question related to opinion about artificial intelligence itself, and this was like kind of like a stock response from these models. When we fine-tuned these models, we got responses that look a little bit more like this, like how actual humans who are time-constrained tend to respond to surveys. Okay. Did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I know that, which is, initially I was surprised at why the distributions were so different from human responses, but that's because it's trained on the entire way.
This is, those are just the pre-trained models without any fine-tuning.
And forgive my naivete, but how is fine-tuning accomplished? You just pack your prompts like saying, act more like these other responses? Or?
This is not, fine-tuning is basically like retraining the model. It's like taking the training a couple of extra steps using specifically human survey data.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So takeaway here is that we're not saying that you should just fine-tune your models with just 100 responses and go away and call it a day, right? But it seems that fine-tuning is helpful. We also, another footnote to this is that we found that modifying the system prompt was way more helpful than modifying the user prompt. So thinking about the role, there's some literature suggesting, right, like the way that you ascribe roles and such. There are frameworks out there that describe this better than I am right now, but that can be helpful for these sorts of tasks, right? Okay. Last part of the talk, what are some good tools for LLMs and surveys? So I'll share some of the tools I like working with, the ones on the top row. The bigger ones are tools I especially like, right? And these are all tools that enhance productivity, right? And that's how I see them. So Elmer is especially a great one. It's sort of part of the POSIT tidy family now. Gander, if you haven't tried it, is a great one too. Very R-centric, right? Olama R is another nice one if you're in the world of locally deployed LLMs. We love locally deployed LLMs. And then there's a whole litany of other ones out there that, if you're an R developer, you should be curious about it and try to use when you can. It's still early days. These tools are obviously evolving. I think they're in very early versions, and so all of this might change. The ones on the top row might shift to the bottom row if you ask me again in a year, right? But I especially like Elmer because Elmer fits in so nicely into the tidy way of doing data science, right? So this entire process of specifying your model, specifying parameters, system prompts versus user prompts, you can do in sort of beautiful dplyr-like syntax. So we really love that. Okay, so Andy mentioned the pizza poll, which I think if you've been to this talk in the past, it's sort of a quintessential feature of this particular talk series. So we're going to do a version of the pizza poll. We're going to do the 2025 version of the pizza poll, which is the AI pizza poll. And so quick disclaimer, I made this in 47 minutes while eating lunch today, so if it breaks, that's not on me. So if you go to this URL here, you'll see some of these ideas, some of these concepts, particularly related to conversational interviewing at play. And so let's we can take it together. I'll give you a chance to scan the QR code. Wouldn't it be funny if it just completely broke right now?
So far, I'm good.
Okay. Thank you, Shiny Deployment. So if we head on over, for some reason it's running very slow. What could that be? So good example of a conversational survey, right? So I love rating pizzas, but sometimes you want to just like describe the pizza that you're eating, right? And this pizza was and so this particular conversational poll, I can't think of any reason why it's running a little bit slower now than when I tested it, right? This will actually have a series of prompts that are sort of an initial implementation of this idea of elaboration and relevance probing here, right? So the system prompts here direct this chatbot to ask for elaboration, if it's on topic, if it's not on topic, to gently steer the respondent on topic, right?
Could you just display the system prompt? That'd be okay.
I wish I could, but this isn't my computer. So at the bar. I promise you the system prompts at the bar, so you're gonna have to come with me to the bar. Okay, so I don't know. Does anyone have feelings about the crust of our pizza?
It's all right.
Pretty good. All right.
It was meh.
So what this does is it actually takes the entire conversation after 2 probes. You could change this to be an infinite number of probes if you're made of money. and it actually then summarizes it. It actually generates the rating after the conversation, right? And then you can actually, this is the idea of confirmation probing, right? You take the output of the LLM instead of entering an open-ended response back, you can just say, hey, that sounds right to me. Okay, so like it says here, your PEDS opinions will be scientifically analyzed with extreme rigor by Jared specifically. Okay, back to our talk, an example of conversational interviewing. This was made with Shiny Chat and with Elmer. I will reveal the system prompts to you at the bar. So where do we go from here other than doing this thing that really irritates me, which is saying that's not X, that's Y on every single thing you post on LinkedIn? Is there some other way to use LLMs in our lives, right? So I've been talking about answering questions, couple of questions that I want to ask now that I don't have answers to. So before we hand over survey research to the robots, I think we need to think about specifically where LLMs can be most helpful in the process of survey research, right? Is it primarily efficiency? Is it actually about improving data quality? It seems from some of these initial tests, it does improve data quality, but we need to be mindful of costs. We also need to be mindful of the audience here, right? So are we building AI for consumers versus primarily for producers of research? And again, this gets back to the question of whether it's worth it, I think gets back to costs, right? We're in a sort of weird paradigm here where the actual costs of using these models as consumers, as all of us, is rapidly decreasing, where the cost of training these models, the pre-training, is actually increasing by a lot in some cases. And so where do we go from here? I don't have an answer to that. And I think there's maybe a bigger question here about how our tools fit into the AI ecosystem. You might think that this is a question, not just about AI, but about data science in general, right? And I think that in this kind of AI paradigm shift, it forces us to think about what our existing tools are meant to be doing, right? So I think, and I have reason to believe, that R is really, really great for evaluating LLMs. The question about whether we can use it for production systems, I think, is an important one to think about, and what exactly it is offering that the Pythonistas, who are 90% of the people in the AI world, what is it that we can offer that they can't do themselves in Python, right? And two other pleas I would make is that we need standards specifically for reproducibility and transparency. And here's where I think the sort of great professional and research consortia that we have, like APOR, can really play a role. We've had issues like this come up before when we moved from probability surveys to non-probability surveys, and I think we're going to need to do this again in this next phase of survey research. So we'll have more to say about that soon, later this year, early next year. And we also have to have standards about transparency. These two things are hand in hand, right? If you're generating a survey, a poll with AI, like we need to know whether this is actually crab or imitation crab, right? We need to know what's going into surveys. And finally, we need more evaluations. So this is a taste of the kinds of evaluations that you could do, but I'm excited to see more. Specifically, beyond things like fine-tuning and prompt engineering, but actually opening up the hood and seeing how changing architectures can help us do better on all these fronts. So with that, I will end and open it up for questions. Questions? Yep.
On your first use case, the classification, you said that it did better than traditional machine learning approaches. What approach exactly? Was it principal components analysis?
So we used auto.
Can you repeat the?
Yeah. So the question was, so what specific machine learning approaches did GPT outperform in the classification use case? So I'm actually not entirely sure. So we use AutoML, which as I understand, there's a sort of model selection phase kind of built into that. So in some sense, you can think about it as horse racing GPT against the best possible machine learning model, given the training data. But to look under the hood to see the exact models, I'd have to check.
I think it was like embedding layer to make a vector embedding.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I knew
Yeah. Yeah, in the back.
So I thought it was like super clear, like the applications for the first and second tasks that you did, but I didn't understand what you had in mind for asking your survey questions to the LLM.
Mm-hmm.
Like, is that just to test their quality, or like what would you see as the application for that?
There's a really radical idea, which is instead of asking humans questions and getting their opinions and waiting months, potentially many months, to understand the COVID vaccination rate in the country, let's skip that and just ask LLMs that. And so this is the question of synthetic
The
response.
LLMs are like an approximation of.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's a controversial idea, and there are tests and there's studies out there that suggest, in some cases, pretty severe limitations of that. But it's a question that people are asking, and I don't necessarily think it's a one or the other. I think if you think about it, there's all of our crab meat's a little bit imitation crab meat. It's not 100% crab meat. Non-probability surveys, in some sense, are a little bit imitation crab meaty, right? But there's some crab meat in there, and so the question is, how do we integrate this but still have a little bit of crab in there? Yeah.
Just to follow up on that, because I'm working on a sort of practical application in a commercial environment. So I've been doing survey research, market research teams for years and years, working on B2B audiences that are very hard to reach, so unresponsive in really large companies. And some of the ways that AI is looking at, so we're going to do, we've tried some different stuff with synthetic, and there are different ways of producing synthetic data, but there are some ways even that the way that people participate in panels now, there's so much financial incentive to also represent yourself as being a senior director of finance at a company with 5,000 plus employees that people can use, and the cost per interview are like, pay like Newton X, sample, whatever, I'll pay like 110 or 115 CPI for like really senior samples, so people can go and imitate that and participate in panels, and then for live interviews, the cost of those interviews can be, like I might pay $1,500 to $2,500 for a really senior person for like an hour-long interview. So we've seen examples of people in panels like they're having a conversation with a live interviewer with the screen off. So to even have like comparability, like synthetic data versus the other stuff is getting so bad that it's. So we're also looking at training some of the synthetic on sales data coming out of like Gong and sales discovery conversations and using that as that plus other data sources.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting point. So the point is about, sort of like the other example of sort of AI-assisted surveys, which is respondents using AI to assist them in taking surveys. And maybe what's encouraging about these results, about the distribution differences in these non-fine-tuned models, is that it maybe makes it pretty easy to detect when that's happening. And so I think you're going to start seeing some of these more powerful detection tools, in some cases built into these platforms themselves. And we've done some work to take what we know about generating survey responses that sound like humans, and then sort of in some sense reverse engineering that and actually being able to detect that. So I think that's certainly gonna change as we move into this world. Andy? First.
Yeah, sure. So there's some interesting work on estimators that combine synthetic sample with human sample, right?
Yeah.
In unbiased ways. Have you all dug into that body of literature at all? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I'm super interested in that. And like I said, we already have ways of filling in what we don't know about the mechanism of responses from humans. I mean, there is a whole literature on synthetic population frames, which has nothing to do with LLMs. And I think That said, there's a potential for contributing, right? So I think, a lot of this existing literature is about holding out respondents or holding out waves of your survey, and then in the kind of machine learning sense, seeing how well your models do. But I think where LLMs or maybe even SLMs, small language models, can do well is holding out questions, right? And evaluating how models can do when it's faced with a question that it's never seen before, which a lot of this literature is with the methods it uses not able to do as well. But I still do think that the evaluation framework that we as data scientists have built for so long, I don't think we should throw that out. I think we should stick to that, but we should see where LLMs can actually contribute in this existing literature. Yeah.
So apart from all these fancy algorithms and fine considerations about models and estimators and stuff, it seems that they may have completely informed. But one of the most touchiest issues with polling is who are you interacting with, and how are you engaging them?
Mm-hmm.
And if you're doing stuff online, is that not a built-in bias? So basically, how does all this automation, all this modeling account for this very, very basic issue of what kind of person are you engaging?
Mm-hmm.
And is that not affected by the sensitivity of the questions you're asking, especially like really touchy political stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. The question is, how, if at all, do LLMs help with these other sources of error in some sense, right? Yeah. Right. I mean, they're questions of, I think what you're referring to is what you might call representation error, right? Are we representing the population accurately at the beginning of our surveys? And then, for sensitive questions, are the people who are responding very, very different in ways that we don't know from the people who are responding, right? And I don't think that LLMs can just, at least the way we've been thinking about this, just go in and solve that problem. I do not think that that's something they can do. Again, there are methods that use very clear assumptions about what we think about the mechanism is true, what we don't think, and I think statistics here has a lot to offer before computer science comes in with these algorithms, right? And so again, let's understand the tools we already have, where they work, where they don't work, and let's have LLMs augment what they do rather than replace, right? There's a reason that my talk is AI-assisted or AI-augmented survey research and not AI for surveys, right? So that's kind of the direction I think we should move.
Cool, we got some online questions for you. First one, so you said that more specific prompts made things worse. How did that happen? What is that?
Yeah, so when we tweaked the user prompt, particularly, I think the question might be, so the question is that prompts, you said that prompts seem to make things worse in some cases. Why is that? And what have you done? So I think that might be referring to, well, I think that could apply to any of these, actually, but I can talk about it a little bit in the context of synthetic response generation. And so there's often an issue of refusal with LLMs. If you ask an LLM to respond like a human or a member of some target population, it'll often refuse to do so. And so here is where tweaking the system prompt actually helps. Telling it to do so in the user prompt is often useless. So that's where we found it was helpful in that application. And similarly in the classification, I mean, part of this is just like best practices that we have beyond survey research, but providing it the class labels and the descriptions, that tends to not work so well in the user prompt. It's usually in the system prompt where that is helpful.
Cool. And then let's go to you.
Yeah.
Speaking of like that previous question, like mentioning LM and the chatbot, the survey questions, making it worse or better. So how exactly do you evaluate making the survey better or worse?
So there's a lot of different approaches that one could use to evaluate whether surveys get better or worse with chatbots. One of the ways we looked at, well, straightforwardly, we had humans actually classify the open-ended responses, and we looked at agreement between humans and LLMs. So here, when we looked at response quality, so these, again, we had humans code the level of relevance in these responses, the level of completion, and so on. And we also, at the very end of our survey, we asked respondents to evaluate how the survey went for them. Was it annoying? Was it useful? Was it engaging? These sorts of things. And again, we, similar to what you see here, we found there were small, almost negligible negative effects, and almost all the negative effects were on mobile. So desktop respondents didn't really experience a worse experience. So lots of different ways you could answer them.
Cool. And then one last one from online here. Did you say something about AI-assisted surveys reducing the response variance?
Yeah, so the question is about whether AI-assisted interviewing reduces response variance, if I understood correctly. So there is to kind of take a step back here, there is a question about, when we talk about one of the benefits of standardized interviewing is that it reduces variance in responses, right? If you reduce variance in how the question is asked, you tend to reduce variance in how the responses are given. And so one reason you might not like conversational interviewing is, are you getting different responses because people have different attitudes, or is it because the question is changing, right? So it gets in this question of construct validity, right? We as data scientists, we're measuring things, we care about construct validity. And I think that there are serious issues there, right? Do we really know that the conversation, that tweaking these questions, is that giving us for sure better answers, or is it just changing the construct? I've been starting to see some work evaluating exactly that, but I think we still need more work to be done there. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah?
Maybe I have one question. Maybe do you think about the model and have some validation of the process of making the survey to get some not good answers or not consistent answers to the question?
Yeah, so the question, as I understand it, is about validation and about whether respondents are giving consistent answers to these kinds of surveys. I think this is where having a panel, panel was mentioned earlier. I think having a panel where we're able to observe respondents give the same, answer the same question rather over time, that could be one way of us being able to understand, kind of tease out whether, what's the role that the LLM is playing in this.
The person tried to answer the same question.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly, over different time periods. So that could be another way of doing that, yeah. I think that introduces other challenges, and that's partly why I think the holdout, holding out some part of your sample or holding out some questions is maybe attractive, but I think there's a more core survey methodology question there. But yeah, that is definitely one way to validate. Yeah. Yeah, one more question, yeah.
Just related to that, were you talking about consistency within a set of survey questions? So somebody asks first, does your company have, X number of people, and then does the software that you use have X number of users, so that the responses are consistent within the survey? Maybe better for.
Yeah, we can talk about it offline. We'll have riveting conversations at the bar. But any last questions in the room?
Can I
Okay.
just test
Yeah.
my understanding of
Sure.
something? So whenever you're working with the LLM off shelves, it's a very generalized kind of approach to. So if you're trying to do something that you need to be effective at a very specialized field,
Yeah.
So you're going to have to handle not only how general the model is, but also figure out ways to customize it.
Mm-hmm.
So without going all the way to fine tuning. So the efficiency, the effectiveness of a model is going to depend a lot on how specialized is the issue you're dealing with and your interviewee.
Yeah.
So it's like this would be applicable to general conversations, simpler surveys to simpler issues. But as soon as you go very specialized, your validations are going to start to look a lot different, right?
I think that's right, and I think that's partly what you're seeing in our results here, right? So preferred news source, I think there's a reason why the accuracy for that was the lowest, right? In that preferred news source is like all proper nouns, right? And you might think that there's variable levels of like pre-training on exactly those. And again, like the confusion between different kinds of CNN, right? So I think that intuition is right, and I think that prompt engineering can go some of the way, right? We tested this all zero shot. I think many shot might be an improvement, but I think fine tuning is probably the way to go. I think,
So looking at the sort of research within the scope of specialized expert surveys versus general surveys might be an important distinction to make.
I think so, and I think that as we decide where we're going to be using LLMs as a field of survey researchers, I think there will be more specialized models themselves that are better suited for different kinds of questions or different populations. So I'm excited for that.
Cool. Please
Cool.
join me in thanking our
All right.
speakers.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, folks. So you got to see Soubhik's wonderful version of the pizza poll. If you go to bit.ly/pizza poll, you can take the real pizza poll and tell us how tonight's pizza was. We still have a lot left. Please take it home. Please think about how your responses to Soubhik's version versus ours changed. Thank you so much for coming out. We're going to go to White Horse Tavern. White Oak. Why are there two? Okay. White Oak Tavern. Right around the corner. So come join us. That way. Okay, that way. On Waverly. All right. Thanks so much, folks.